Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody, for coming. David is right. I'm really grateful to him and to Gabby for the excellent work they do at the Global Center. World Christianity, global evangelical mindedness, Christian missions are so important. And a big part of my vision for the future of Beeson Divinity School is to develop us into an even more, ever more globally minded, globally useful gospel community. And as I've said to David, I think the Global Center can play a really big part in enabling that. So I'm grateful to him all the time, grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today. As you can see from the title of my talk, Modern Evangelicalism and Global Christian Identity, I'm not talking directly about missions today, but I am talking indirectly about missions. I want us to understand what it means to call ourselves evangelical. And I think evangelicalism has always been a very globally minded, missions-minded movement. And what I want to do today with us is convince us that it's a bad idea to reduce our understanding of evangelical identity in the way the mainstream media often reduce it. These days, if you live in the United States and you watch CNN or Fox News or whichever channel you watch, you get the impression that evangelicals are white people who like Donald Trump. And please don't worry, this is not a political talk. I'm not going to speak for or against Donald Trump, for or against the Republican Party, anything like that. My goal today, though, is simply to convince us, to persuade us that evangelicalism is and always has been a global movement, an international movement, an intentionally international, interethnic, interdenominational, interconfessional gospel movement. So that's my goal today. As you can see on the handout, I'm going to talk about several subtopics here. Fear not, I'm not going to go on and on and on. I'm going to talk about these things pretty quickly and simply, try to be as clear as I can. And I thought one thing that I'd do maybe at the beginning and the end of my talk today, just so you can process what I'm telling you well, is just lay out for you my three main points in today's talk. Point one, historically speaking, evangelicalism is not what you'd guess by watching CNN. Or pick your favorite news program. I'm not picking on CNN here. But evangelicalism is not what you'd guess it is if you just watch the mainstream media. I grant that in the U.S., the evangelical movement has been affected quite a bit by the culture wars and by the politics of the religious right. There's no denying that. But I think to reduce our movement to that would be not only historically inaccurate, sociologically misleading, I'm going to try to argue it will also harm the cause of Christ. It will also harm the cause of intercultural missions and fellowship and collaboration across national, cultural, denominational lines with other believers in other parts of the world. All right, so that's my first main point. Historically speaking, evangelicalism is not what you'd guess by watching CNN today. My second main point, historically speaking, evangelicalism has always been, and I've said this already, but here's saying it in the form of my second main point, we've always been an international, interethnic, interdenominational movement of the Spirit aimed at gospel promotion, spiritual renewal, and kingdom work. This is not to deny that politics are important. It's not to say that evangelicals shouldn't be involved in cultural engagement, political life. I think we should be involved in those things. And it's not to say that good Christians won't agree on some aspects of the political debates that roil in our context. Again, it's simply to say that at our best, we've always been very intentionally international, interdenominational. And so trying to portray evangelicalism in terms of one nation's politics, one nation's culture wars, is misleading and again harmful to the cause of Christ. Then my third main point, what our churches need today is to recognize these truths, renew their commitment to ecumenical gospel work, and help each other find a good balance between international Christian identity on the one hand and our national and regional social relevance on the other hand. And that balance is not always easy to achieve. Let me read that third main point again so it registers. What our churches need today is to recognize these truths about evangelical identity and history, renew their commitment to ecumenical gospel work, and help each other find a good balance between their international Christian identity on the one hand and their efforts at national and regional social, cultural relevance on the other hand. All right, so just to prime the pump for the case I want to make for us today, let me ask you to turn to page 2 in this little packet. We're not going to look at everything in this packet. I wanted to give you some things you could take home with you, keep in your files, in case you ever get asked to talk about this sometime. But I do want to give us about 7 minutes at the beginning of our time here together to talk about the issues that emerge on page 2 here. I've got 3 facts and 4 questions for discussion. Fact 1, there are several hundred million evangelicals today around the world. And the footnote shows you how I get my numbers. Most of whom live outside the West. Fact 2, evangelicals are found in literally thousands of different denominations. Fact 3, nobody's in charge of international evangelicalism, and the movement has no official doctrinal statement. All right, so that leads to questions about, then, who are we? Right? I mean, if you look at Beeson's promotional materials, you will notice that there are 3 modifiers we use to describe ourselves more than any others. You know what they are? We're interdenominational, we're evangelical, and we're ecumenical. So the question I'm addressing today is, what does it mean to say at Beeson that we are evangelical? And I'm trying to expand our horizons in a kind of global way as we think about what it means to say that we're evangelical. All right, but it's difficult to say what an evangelical is today because of the facts that I provided for you here. There are so many of us. We're all around the world. Nobody's in charge of us. You know, we have organizations in which we join forces for common gospel work, and some of those organizations, of course, have leaders and doctrinal statements. But it's difficult when you recognize the global diversity of evangelicalism to nail down precisely what an evangelical is. So I want to get you thinking about this, and I'm going to do most of the talking today, but at this point in the hour, I want to give us 5 minutes to turn to your neighbors, to group up with the 2 or 3 people right next to you. And I want to get you thinking about, before you listen to me say too much about it, I want to get you thinking about, so what do you think an evangelical is? And what do you think we should do when people ask us to describe and to define our evangelical identity? But was there something really interesting that anybody thought emerged from your small group discussion that should inform the way we think about evangelical identity today?
Well, in the light of our conversation, I think the question would be, have you ever thought of giving up on the term? Because it's so co-opted by the culture?
I have thought a lot about this in work with students and church groups. I have not thought seriously about giving up the term myself, but as a teacher in seminaries, I know full well that lots of people in groups like this have indeed thought about it, largely because they're uneasy about its political co-optation in the U.S. And they don't want others to identify them in the way it seems like the mainstream media identify evangelicals. Part of the reason I'm giving the talk I'm giving today, though, is because I want to try to expand our view of what an evangelical is so that we're more likely to want to continue to embrace the term. I think that the Lord has used the evangelical movement in some pretty special, powerful ways, and I'd hate to see that heritage get squandered simply because we're embarrassed today. This is not me saying you should feel bad if you've seriously considered distancing yourself from the label. It's just me trying to talk you back into a use of the label and back into the evangelical movement, back into a willingness to champion one of the three key modifiers of Beeson Divinity School. Obviously, evangelicals are diverse. On pages 3 through 6 or so of the handout, which we're not going to look at today carefully, what I've done for you is given you sort of what the big hitters in the academic debate about evangelical identity and history say when they get asked to work on the definition of evangelicalism. What I'll say about those pages that I'm going to skip over is simply this. I've organized the quotations from those big hitters into three different groups. Group one is people who like to use the evangelical label and like to define evangelicalism in terms of our unity, but aren't always very specific about what the difference is between evangelicalism and other kinds of serious Christianity practiced by people who would not, either in the past or in the present, identify with the evangelical movement. The people in group one sometimes define evangelicalism just as like good Christianity. If you're going to be a good Christian or a true Christian or a real Christian, you're going to identify with the evangelical label. The reality is there's lots of real Christians, serious Christians, true Christians who don't readily identify with the evangelical label, though. That leads us to the second section of quotations from the big hitters. Those are people who are so taken by evangelical diversity that they question whether you really can define evangelicalism specifically. Their tendency is to say things like, well, if you stand far enough back, it looks like all those people who call themselves evangelicals have a certain family resemblance. It's hard to define it precisely, but yeah, I mean, we see something going on. And then the people in category 3, what page is that? 5, page 5 in the packet. Those are people who are usually conservative Calvinists or conservative Lutherans who've just decided they don't care very much about the evangelical movement anymore. They'd just much rather be known as a conservative Lutheran, a conservative Calvinist, some kind of Orthodox confessional Protestant, rather than as an evangelical. Because they think that there's too much that goes under the name evangelicalism that they don't like and they don't want to associate with. The way I tend to define evangelicalism is by calling us, shorthand, Orthodox Protestants with an 18th century twist. I think it's important to say evangelicalism is not a denomination with a structure, with a hierarchy, with a doctrinal statement of its own, at least not a detailed doctrinal statement of its own. Evangelicalism is a movement, an interdenominational movement. And like any movement, there are going to be people who are closer to the center of the movement than others, and people who only want to associate with the movement tangentially from time to time in ad hoc ways. But it seems to me, if you're asking the question, what's at the center of the evangelical movement, past and present? It's a theologically conservative kind of Protestantism, and there are lots of different kinds of Protestantism, right? So there are theologically conservative Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Independents, Lutherans, etc. And they all sometimes associate with the evangelical movement. And the thing that they all have in common, aside from being theologically traditional, is that they've been shaped by the revivals of the 18th century. Our modern international, interdenominational, interethnic evangelical movement really coalesced for the first time during the revivals of the Great Awakening in the 18th century, during which time lots of congregations and denominations divided over what was going on during the revivals. And we saw a reconfiguration of the Protestant world take place as a result of the revivals, and a new movement of people who were pro-revival, pro-reformation, pro-renewal, who joined forces together across the old national, denominational, confessional boundaries that had divided up Europe for centuries, even in the Protestant world, for the sake of working collaboratively on gospel promotion, spiritual renewal, and kingdom work. So that's what I mean by Orthodox Protestants with an 18th century twist. Can I move us now to point 2 on the outline on page 1 of the packet? This is my effort to put numbers on, to quantify the size and the shape of evangelical Christianity and reinforce this notion that it really is and has long been an intentionally international movement. All right, so there's roughly 7.7 billion people in the world today, roughly 330 million in the US. There are roughly 2.5 billion Christians in the world, nearly a third of the global population. And I tell you what the other world religions have in terms of numbers these days. Move to that next little paragraph of items. This is the most important one for my purposes today. During the 1970s, the balance of the Christian population worldwide shifted from the West to the global South. And now, in the year 2019, the continents with the most Christians are, in order, number 1, Africa, number 2, Latin America, number 3, Europe, number 4, Asia, number 5, North America. I want that to reinforce this notion for us that our evangelical Christian identity should not be too particularly American. There are lots more people who are kindred spirits with you, theologically, practically, spiritually, outside of this country than there are inside of this country. I think it's important for us to develop an awareness of that, an appreciation of that, so that we can work more intentionally with such people to do collaborative gospel work and kingdom building. Right? So then what I say, and here's the real kicker. So clearly, the U.S. is not the center of the global Christian church, or even of the evangelical movement. Of the several hundred million evangelicals in the world, only about 80 million are in the U.S. All right, so we're a global movement. We're a movement, the preponderance of whose people are in the global South, not in the West, let alone in the U.S. That brings us to the question in items 3 and 4 on the handout here. How did we get to be this way? How do we get to be such a big, diverse, international movement? I want to say 2 things just to keep this short and sweet. First thing, we've always been an international movement. We haven't always been as international as we are now, but from the very early years of the revivals of the 18th century, we have been international. Then the second thing I want to say is that especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, evangelical commitment to cross-cultural evangelism, missions, disciple-making further internationalized our movement. And also came with some tensions, some problems, we'll discuss in a minute, associated with missions. Because even though evangelicalism was sort of a grassroots, ground-up, voluntaristic movement of people who joined hands across all the old boundaries for the sake of doing missions together, evangelicals in our early years, indeed evangelicals even a little bit today, are not quite past all the colonialist, imperialist assumptions about what good Christianity looks like. It's always been hard for us, for reasons that I hope you'll sympathize with, right? This isn't me judging people from the past. It's just raising a tension that's always been part of a movement like ours that's been so globally missions-minded. There's always a tension when we try to think about what good Christianity looks like in practice in parts of the world whose cultural heritages are different from ours. Right? So the missionaries who spread Christianity around the world sometimes had a difficult time distinguishing between good Christian discipleship, good biblical Christianity that you should find looking roughly the same way everywhere in the world, on the one hand, from the sorts of cultural packaging that Christianity came in their own country, their home country. Right? So some of the missionaries, in well-intentioned ways, spread assumptions about how you dress and how you organize your family life and how you eat and how you educate your children along with the gospel. And we still struggle with these kinds of things. I think missiologists are better today at helping us with these kinds of things than they used to be. But I admit this has always been part of the struggle. But what I want to point out or remind you of is that despite that admission, despite the problem we've always had distinguishing between our cultural assumptions and what the Bible really teaches, evangelicalism, more than most religious movements in the history of the world, has been very intentionally international, interdenominational, globally minded. From the very beginning of the revivals of the 18th century, evangelicals were the ones in all the different denominations of the West who were pro-renewal, pro-reform, pro-revival, who were in favor of encouraging serious discipleship in their churches, in their towns, in their denominations. And the people who opposed evangelicalism were the ones who thought that their state church Christianity was just fine and you don't need a bunch of evangelical rabble-rousers making you feel guilty for not being sufficiently reformed all the time. Because evangelicalism was always so seriously committed to gospel purity and gospel promotion, evangelicals also pioneered the modern missions movement in far greater numbers than any other group of Christians did. So it's not a coincidence that in the late 18th century and in the 19th century, most of the significant missions boards, mission sending agencies, were organized by, staffed by, funded by evangelicals who didn't mind working together on the cause of the gospel with people who were different from them, because they recognized that the kingdom of God is supposed to be diverse. And then over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, when lots of Christians, often led by evangelicals, thought very intently about, so what are we learning about Christ and culture, about the balance between our international Christian identity on the one hand and our local, regional, social, and cultural relevance on the other hand, it's not a surprise that most of the most helpful people who reflected on those questions also had a connection to evangelicalism and evangelical missions. And this brings us to the last two pages in the packet that you have in front of you, pages 7 and 8. I find Andrew Walls and Lamin Sana to be the two most helpful people there are to read when it comes to thinking about how you balance your commitment to good biblical gospel Christianity on the one hand with the cultural packaging that you're used to presenting good Christianity in and through on the other hand. Andrew Walls is English, lives in Scotland now, had a very formative period in his early life where he taught in Sierra Leone and Nigeria. He'd been trained as a church historian in a very Western way, a very Eurocentric way. He'd been trained to believe and assume and teach other people to believe and assume that the most important things that have ever happened in the history of Christianity happened in Europe. Then he was asked as a young man to go and teach church history in Sierra Leone and in Nigeria. and to talk about church history in a way that made good sense to the people in those countries. And it just blew his world. He went through a serious period of reorientation trying to figure out which elements of church history that had been part of European history were worth promoting in Sierra Leone or Nigeria, and which part should be left off the syllabus for the sake of including more on West African church history. Walls is not somebody who's written a lot of books, but he's written a bunch of really thoughtful articles on these questions. And he's the one I put first on the handout. I've got him first and third. Let me read this first paragraph for you and see what you think. This is one of the things I think we have learned based on 2 or 3 centuries of reflection on how to do collaborative, cross-cultural, evangelistic work as evangelicals, globally minded evangelicals. So Walls insists, this is me quoting and paraphrasing him in one paragraph. Walls insists Christianity has always been an incarnational faith spread through limited cultural forms. No one ever meets universal Christianity in itself, he says. We only ever meet Christianity in a local form. And that means a historically, culturally conditioned form. He continues, we need not fear this. When God became man, he became historically, culturally conditioned man in a particular time and place. What he became, we need not fear to be. There's nothing wrong with having local forms of Christianity, provided that we remember that they are local. Our concern as gospel witnesses in cross-cultural settings should be to oppose all instances of cultural chauvinism and imperial aggression, unilateral cultural force exerted with ethnocentric prejudice. Or as Walls concludes the matter, the principal dangers of cultural contact come when one party insists that its own local features have universal validity. So this is Andrew Walls freeing up missionaries from being too self-conscious and guilt-ridden all the time, about their cultural particularity, and helping them to see, of course you're going to be culturally particular. Of course you're coming from someplace, and you have assumptions about what the best ways to live are, and dress are, and eat are, and raise your children are, and so on. But let's just be careful to distinguish your cultural baggage from the gospel and the Bible themselves. Easier said than done, of course, but that's a principle to bear in mind. Right, then Lamin Sanneh gets even more interesting because he's a convert from Islam. The Gambian church historian, I'm in paragraph 2 here, Lamin Sanneh applied this theme insightfully in a lot of places. As a convert from Islam, he was well placed to see the beautiful cultural diversity intrinsic to Christianity, especially when compared to Islam, and the cultural malleability of an incarnated faith. Christianity, says Sanneh, he passed away recently, is the religion of over 2,000 different language groups. Whereas Muslims, when they study the Quran, get it right really only in Arabic. He's trying to say there's something about God's plan for our cultural diversity in Christianity that causes us to celebrate the fact that we can translate this faith and translate our Holy Scriptures into so many different languages. More people pray and worship in more languages in Christianity than in any other religion in the world. Furthermore, Christianity has been the impulse behind the creation of more dictionaries and grammars of the world's languages than any other force in history. Christianity, then, is not a religion of cultural uniformity, and its pluralism is not just a matter of regrettable doctrinal splits and ecclesiastical fragmentation. Rather, our faith is meant to be spread and to grow through multicultural exchange, witness, dialogue, and partnership in ministry. The Christian church is built by God as faithful, humble witnesses put flesh on His grace, mercy, and love without exhibiting favoritism. All right, so how do you do this? My last quotation, I know there's 4 paragraphs here. In the interest of time, I'm just going to read one more. Andrew Walls has recommended something with respect to how to balance the international aspect of our evangelical Christian identity on the one hand with our local and regional cultural allegiances and inheritances and preferences and so on the other hand. He's done it in a few different places. My favorite is this place that I put on the bottom of paragraph 3 here, the gospel as prisoner and liberator of culture. Let's see what he says. The challenge for cross-cultural Christian witnesses is mainly to balance what Walls wants us to call the Christian faith's indigenizing principle with its twin, the Pilgrim Principle. So there's an indigenizing principle and a Pilgrim Principle, and he's going to say the challenge is to figure out how best to balance these two principles. The indigenizing principle for Walls reminds us that Christian faith is always and only expressed in terms of concrete cultural forms, because we're finite. The fact that if any man is in Christ, he's a new creation, does not mean that he starts or continues his life in a vacuum, or that his mind is a blank table or blank slate. It's been formed by his own culture and history. And since God has accepted him as he is, his Christian mind will continue to be influenced by what was in it before. And this is as true for groups as for persons. All churches are culture churches, including mine and including yours. The Pilgrim Principle, that was the indigenizing principle, right? The principle that you use to think about contextualizing the faith. Here's the other one. The Pilgrim Principle, by contrast, states that all Christianity is universal too. Christians are pilgrims and strangers here, reference to the book of Hebrews. We have no abiding earthly city. We and our cultures need to be transformed by the heavenly King of Kings. And Walls unpacks this Pilgrim Principle with profound historical wisdom. The Christian is given an adoptive past. He's linked to the people of God in all generations, like him, members of the faith family, and most strangely of all, to the whole history of Israel, the curious continuity of the race of the faithful from Abraham. By this means, the history of Israel is part of church history. It's part of your history and my history. And all Christians of whatever nationality are landed by adoption with several millennia of someone else's history, with a whole set of ideas, concepts, and assumptions which do not necessarily square with the rest of their cultural inheritance. And the church in every land, of whatever race and type of society, has this same adoptive past, by which it needs to interpret the fundamentals of the faith. The adoption into Israel becomes a universalizing factor, bringing Christians of all cultures and ages together through a common inheritance. Lest any of us make the Christian faith such a place for us ourselves to feel at home that nobody else can live there, and bringing into everyone's society some sort of outside reference. The question of our identity, our place within the church as evangelicals or Christians, no matter where in the world we live, must be answered in reference to both our cultural differences and our unity as pilgrims, brothers and sisters, fellow heirs of God with Christ. All right, and then I end with a question of where do we go from here? Rather than reading that last paragraph, I'll send it home with you and summarize it for you here. It's kind of a hodgepodge of quotations from some of my favorite thinkers who do church history on what it means to think of ourselves as inheritors both of particular cultural traditions and of the history of Israel and of the Christian faith. And the point they're all making similarly is that we need to recognize that that Christianity is polycentric. There is no one earthly center to Christianity, and that's by divine design. And evangelicals are people who've done better than most other groups at recognizing and celebrating this, despite all the problems that I've already admitted we've had sometimes in sharing the gospel across cultural lines. And with Andrew Walls, I think that the challenge for us today, if we're going to be more faithful in embracing, appropriating, and moving forward our evangelical legacy, especially with respect to missions, the challenge is for us to figure out how best to embrace today, balance today, the Pilgrim Principle and the Indigenizing Principle. It seems to me that in some places in the world today, the Christian faith is under-contextualized. You know what I mean by that? The Christian faith seems to be too foreign in many places in the global South today. There are still lots of people who struggle with the question, is Christianity a Western religion that's been imposed on us? About 10 years ago, I was working through some of these issues at a conference in Hong Kong. And I was surrounded by Chinese nationals who were asking the question, how can we get past this situation in China where we still have so many people saying, one more Christian, one less Chinese? Because of England's imperial aspirations in China, lots of Chinese people still assume Christianity is this white Western religion that Westerners tried to impose on us because they wanted to sell opium in China and so on. That's a little bit oversimplified, but not way oversimplified. So there's some places in the world today, lots of places in the world today, where I think the Christian faith needs to be further indigenized, further contextualized. But I would argue the United States is not one of those places. The United States is a place where I think we've over-contextualized the Christian faith to the point where there's lots of people we know in our churches, our families, our neighborhoods, who struggle with distinguishing between being a good, God-fearing, patriotic American on the one hand, and being a faithful follower of Jesus on the other hand. It too easily, in contexts where there's been an over-contextualization, goes hand in hand. All right, so let me return to my three main points so you don't miss them, and you can take them away after all that, and then see if there's some questions for discussion. Historically speaking, evangelicalism is not what you'd guess by watching CNN or Fox News or MSNBC. Point two, historically speaking, evangelicalism has always been an international, interethnic, interdenominational movement of the Spirit aimed at gospel promotion, spiritual renewal, and kingdom work. Certainly with implications for culture, for politics, for culture wars, etc. But it's not been mainly about those things. And main point number three, what our churches need today is to recognize these truths, renew their commitment to ecumenical gospel work, and help each other find a good balance between their international Christian identity on the one hand and their national and regional social relevance on the other hand. All right, so Beeson is an evangelical divinity school. I think that means something very special. It means we have this wonderful history of being missions-minded, globally minded, internationally minded collaborators. In the 1500s and 1600s, Beeson Divinity School was not possible because the Protestant world in Western Europe was zoned. It was divided up on state church confessional lines. It would have been hard to imagine a Beeson Divinity School, even if you were really the best kind of Christian in the 16th to the 17th centuries in Europe. It's only possible to come together in this kind of collaborative, interdenominational, interethnic, interracial, international manner because of these revivals that brought people together across all those old boundaries for the sake of promoting the cause of Christ together. And I hope we'll recognize that. I hope we'll thank the Lord for that heritage. I hope we'll think critically about how best to appropriate it and improve it in the next generation. But my plea would be that we not abandon it.